It's like heaven." "You've arranged it delightfully," he said. "I suppose what I like is the wonderful feeling of being here in my own country and my own town, of being alone in it." "You like being alone so much?" "Yes, as long as my friends prevent me from feeling lonely." She sat down, lying back in her chair and putting her hands behind her head. "This is the hour I like best, don't you?" A sense of his own importance made him say, "I was afraid you'd forgotten the time. Beaufort must have been a very interesting companion." She looked amused. "Why, have you waited long? Mr. Beaufort took me to see some houses. My family want me to move to a better area. But what does it matter where one lives?" "This street just isn't fashionable." "Fashionable? Do you all think so much of that? Why not make one's own fashions? But I suppose I've lived too independently. Now I want to do what you all do. I want to feel cared for and safe." He was touched. "That's what your friends want you to feel." But he suspected she still did not realize how close to social disaster she had been before the van der Luydens had saved her. So he said, "Last night the best families in New York were looking after you." "I know. It was such a nice party," she replied lightly. These words were hardly adequate, Newland felt, for the social importance of that event. "The van der Luydens," he said seriously, "are the most influential people in New York. Unfortunately, because they are elderly and in poor health, they do not often receive guests." "Isn't that the reason for their great influence?" she said thoughtfully. "It's because they are hardly ever seen." He stared at her and suddenly realized she was right. He laughed and thought no more about the van der Luydens. "But you'll explain these things to me, won't you?" Madame Olenska continued. "You'll tell me all I ought to know?" "It's you who are telling me, opening my eyes to things I've looked at so long that I no longer really see them." He wanted to say, "Don't be seen driving about the streets with Beaufort," but he was being too deeply drawn into the atmosphere of the room to give advice of that kind. He felt a long way from New York. He was in Samarkand, from where New York looked strangely small and distant, as indeed it would. The Countess bent over the fire, holding her thin hands out to the flames, and her face seemed pale in the firelight. "Your family," Newland added, "can advise you, especially the older women." She shook her head. "Oh, I know, all my aunts and my grandmother. But only if they don't hear anything unpleasant. Does no one want to know the truth here, Mr. Archer? The real loneliness is living among all these kind people who only ask me to pretend." She put her head in her hands and started crying. "Madame Olenska, oh, don't, Ellen!" he cried, jumping up and bending over her. He took one of her hands, holding and rubbing it like a child's, but she soon freed herself and looked up at him with wet eyes. "Does no one cry here, either? I suppose there's no need to in heaven," she said with a laugh. Newland realized with horror that he had called her Ellen. The use of first names between young people was only permitted if they were engaged. Somewhere, in his mind's eye, he could see the tall white figure of May Welland. She seemed very far away. Suddenly, the servant came in and spoke in Italian to the Countess. She showed in a strange-looking couple, the Duke of St. Austrey and Mrs. Struthers, a large lady with unnaturally black hair, painted lips, and an expensive fur coat. They had come to invite Madame Olenska to a musical evening at Mrs. Struthers' house on Sunday evening. Madame Olenska accepted with delight, and Mrs. Struthers waved a cheerful hand at Newland. "And bring your young gentleman with you," she said. Newland escaped as quickly as he could. He had no wish to become involved with the socially unacceptable Mrs. Struthers. As he went out into the wintry night, the feeling of Samarkand disappeared. New York was all around him again, and May Welland the loveliest woman in it. He went straight to a flower shop, to send her the daily box of sweet-smelling white flowers, which he realized he had forgotten to send that morning. While in the shop, he noticed a huge bunch of yellow roses. They were not May's kind of flower, too rich, too strong, too exotic for her. He gave the assistant the Countess's address and told him to send them there at once, but he did not like to put his name on the card. The next day, he persuaded May to escape for a walk in the park. It was a sunny winter's day, with snow on the ground, and the cold air brought out the color in May's lovely face. Newland felt proud to have such beauty walking next to him, and he felt his doubts and worries disappear. They talked about the flowers he sent her every day, and he confessed that he had sent roses to the Countess. May was delighted he was being so kind to her cousin. Then Newland started talking about their own plans, their future, and Mrs. Welland's insistence on a long engagement.
"But aren't we very happy as we are?" May asked, smiling brilliantly up at him.
"We could be even happier. We could be together all the time. We could be traveling."
"That would be lovely," she replied, "but Mother would not understand us wanting to do things so differently from other couples."
Suddenly, he felt quite desperate. Would he ever be able to reach the real May Welland through the wall of custom and social expectation which divided them? And what if, when he finally broke down the wall, there was nobody there?
"Do we have to do things the way everyone else does?" he cried, almost wildly. "Can't you and I be different, May?"
Her eyes rested on him with a bright, unclouded admiration.
"But we can't just run away together, can we?" she asked. "You know, like people in books."
"Why not?
Why not? Why not?"
She looked a little bored by his insistence.
"I'm not clever enough to argue with you, but that sort of thing is rather vulgar, isn't it?"
"Are you so much afraid of being vulgar?" She was clearly shocked by his question.
"Of course I am, and so are you," she replied sharply.
Then, sure of having found the right way to close the discussion, she went on light-heartedly.
"Oh, did I tell you that I showed Ellen my ring? She thinks it's the most beautiful one she ever saw."
All next day he felt depressed. He could see his life stretching tidily ahead of him, with no excitement, no unplanned events, and he was filled with unreasoning horror at the thought of doing the same thing every day at the same hour. The word sameness repeated itself maddeningly inside his head. In the afternoon, Janey came to see him in his library.
"Newland, Mother's very angry," she said.
"Angry? With whom? About what?"
"Your friend, Madame Olenska. She was at Mrs. Struthers' party last night, on a Sunday evening, Newland, when people are at church. She went with the Duke and Mr. Julius Beaufort."
When he heard the last name, a senseless anger took hold of Newland, but he controlled himself and just laughed. "Well, what of it? I knew she meant to go." Janey went pale.
"You knew she meant to go, and you didn't try to stop her, to warn her?"
"Stop her? Warn her?" He laughed again. "I'm not engaged to the Countess Olenska." The words sounded strange in his ears.
"Well, I think you'd better come down and speak to Mother."
In the sitting room, Mrs. Archer was looking very anxious.
"I'm so worried the van der Luydens will be offended," she said.
"Why should they be offended?" Newland asked.
"Because she went to the house of that vulgar woman."
"Well, Mrs. Struthers may be vulgar," said Newland, "but she has good music and amuses people on Sunday evenings when the whole of New York is dying of boredom." "Good music? All I know is there was a woman who got up on a table and sang the things they sing at the places you go to in Paris. There was smoking and champagne." "Well, that kind of thing happens in other places, and the world still goes on." At this moment in the argument, the servant came to the door and announced, "Mr. Henry van der Luyden." A visit from this gentleman was such an unusual event that both ladies looked quite frightened, but Newland remained calm. "Come in, sir," he said, going forward to greet his relation. "We were just talking about you, and the Countess Olenska." Mrs. Archer went pale and put a hand to her heart. "Ah, a delightful woman," replied Mr. van der Luyden. "I have just been to see her. The Duke told me to go and see how cleverly she's arranged her sitting-room, and it's true, quite remarkable. I would take Louisa to see the Countess if the area were less unpleasant." There was dead silence. Mr. van der Luyden continued, "The fact is, between ourselves, I wanted to give her a friendly warning about allowing the Duke or anyone else to carry her off to parties with him."
"Has the Duke been carrying her off to parties?" asked Mrs. Archer innocently.
"I'm afraid so, dear Adeline, but Madame Olenska was very grateful for my few words of guidance." And so Mrs. Archer's anxiety about Ellen Olenska's behavior was calmed, for the moment at least. 2 weeks later, Newland was sitting doing nothing in the offices of Letterblair, Lamson & Lowe, the firm of lawyers whom he worked for, when he was called to the private office of the head of the firm, Mr. Letterblair. The old man was clearly a little worried. It appeared that the Countess Olenska wished to get a divorce from her husband. Her family, especially old Mrs. Manson Mingott, wanted to avoid the scandal this would cause. They had sent a number of papers to Mr. Letterblair, asking that Newland Archer, as a future member of the family, should take on the case. They wanted Newland, on behalf of the Letterblair firm, to advise the Countess against divorce. Newland was at first unwilling to get involved in the Countess's private life, but once he had read the papers, which included letters from her husband, he was so horrified by her suffering at the hands of the Count that he agreed to take on the case. He was determined to give her his support no matter what she decided to do. So he made an appointment with her at her house in order to discuss the case. Chapter 4. A Second Visit to the Countess. As Newland walked up Fifth Avenue after dinner that evening, he could see a number of carriages outside the Chiverses, where they were having a party for the Duke. He passed the Beaufort's house and saw Julius himself come out and drive away in his carriage. Probably on his way to that new lady friend of his, thought Newland. All of New York knew about Beaufort's mistresses, and Miss Fanny Ring was the latest in a long line. He walked on into the narrow street where the Countess lived, surrounded by the houses of painters and writers. He and his family belonged to the part of New York society that believed in the importance of literature and art, but fashionable and well-born families rarely mixed socially with artists. Newland himself knew many artists and musicians whom he met in the little bars and clubs which were beginning to open in the back streets, but he would never expect to meet them in a gentleman's house. He imagined that the Countess, whose house was full of books, was used to a much more open society, where writers and artists came and went freely, and that this might be one of the things she would miss from her old life. He reached her house and was let in by the servant girl, who was smiling mysteriously. In the hall was a fur-lined coat and a silk opera hat with the letters J.B. in gold on it. It was clear that Julius Beaufort was visiting Madame Olenska. Newland was so angry that he almost left at once. But then he remembered he had not told the Countess he wished to see her privately, so he could not blame her for opening her doors to other visitors. In the sitting-room, Beaufort was standing in front of the fire, smiling down at the Countess. She was half lying on a sofa, her head supported on one hand. Her sleeve had fallen away to leave her white arm visible up to the elbow. Instead of the usual close-fitting, all-covering silk dress which New York ladies wore when receiving evening visitors, she was wearing a long dress of soft red material, with black fur around the neck and down the front. The effect was certainly pleasing. "Well, well, 3 whole days at Skuytercliff," Beaufort was saying in his loud voice as Newland entered. Skuytercliff was the van der Luydens' country house, just outside New York, and it seemed the Countess was invited there. "It's a pity you'll miss the musical evening I've planned for you on Sunday." She held out her hand to greet Newland as she replied to Beaufort.
"Ah, that does tempt me. Except for the other evening at Mrs. Struthers, I've not met a single artist since I've been here."
"I know 1 or 2 painters, very nice people, who I could bring to see you if you'd allow me," said Newland daringly. "Painters in New York?" asked Beaufort with a laugh. He gave the impression there were none, since he did not buy their pictures.
And Madame Olenska said to Newland, "That would be delightful, but I was thinking of singers, actors, musicians. My husband's house was always full of them."
Newland felt confused. How could she speak so calmly of her married life? But he was pleased to see she wanted to speak to him privately, because she made it clear to Beaufort that he must leave. A few minutes later, they were alone together.
"So, you care for painting, then?" she began by asking.
"Oh, yes, enormously. When I'm in Paris or London, I never miss a show. I try to see all the new pictures."
"My life used to be full of such things, too. But now I want to throw off my old life, to become just like everybody else here."
Newland reddened. "You'll never be like everybody else."
"Ah, don't say that. If you knew how I hate to be different."
Her face looked dark and sad as she spoke. He waited a moment and cleared his throat. "I know you want a divorce. Mr. Letterblair told me. That's why I've come. You see, I'm in the firm." Her eyes brightened.
"You mean you can manage it for me? I can talk to you instead of to Mr. Letterblair? Oh, that will be so much easier. You'll help me, won't you?"
"First," he hesitated, "perhaps I ought to know a little more." She seemed surprised.
"You've read the papers. You know about my husband's mistresses. What could be worse than that? Our church allows divorce in such cases."
"That's true, but—" Newland was thinking of a letter from the Count he had read, accusing his wife of having had an affair with his secretary. How much truth was there in that? Only Ellen could tell. "Of course, you know that if your husband chooses to fight the case, as he threatens to, he can say things."
"Yes?"
"Things that might be disagreeable to you, and say them publicly, even if they aren't true."
"What harm could such accusations, even if he made them publicly, do me here in New York?"
Newland thought, she still knows so little about us. He tried to explain. "This is a very small world compared to the one you've lived in. Our ideas about marriage and divorce are particularly old-fashioned, especially if the woman has put herself, by some unusual behavior, in a position where offensive accusations can be made against her." Her head bent down low, and Newland waited, hoping desperately for a little anger, or at least just a word to tell him that no accusation would be true. No word came. A clock ticked softly in a corner, and the whole room seemed to be waiting silently with Newland.
"Yes,"
she whispered at last.
"That's what my family say. And you're one of them, or will be soon. Do you share their view?"
He looked away from her for a moment. How could he say, "Yes, if what your husband says is true"? Instead, he said gently, "Is a divorce really worth it when there's the possibility, the certainty, of a lot of unpleasantness?"
"But my freedom, isn't that worth it?"
"It's my business, you know, to help you see these things as the people who are fondest of you see them." He was filling the silence with meaningless talk. He could do nothing else, since she would not or could not say the one word that would have cleared the air and told him the truth. Suddenly she stood up. "Very well. I will do what you wish," she said. The blood rushed to his face, and he caught her hands in his. I do want to help you," he said. "You do help me. Good night, my cousin." He bent and kissed her hands, which were cold and lifeless. When she took them away, he turned to the door, found his coat and hat in the hall, and ran out into the winter night, bursting with unspoken words. A week later, Newland was at Wallack's Theatre, watching one of that season's most popular plays. He had seen it several times, and one particular scene was his favorite. He was watching it now. In a room, two lovers said goodbye, sadly, almost wordlessly, and the man started towards the door. The woman turned away from him to the fireplace and looked down into the fire. She was wearing a long gray dress with long black ribbons falling down her back. At the door, her lover turned for one last look at her. Then he walked quietly back, lifted one of the ribbons, kissed it, and left the room without her hearing him or changing her position. And on this silent parting, the curtain fell. Newland thought this as fine as anything he had ever seen in the theaters of Paris and London. The silence and the dumb misery of the lovers' goodbye moved him greatly, and it reminded him, he could not have said why, of his goodbye to Madame Olenska after their conversation a week earlier. When he had left her, he had the feeling that Count Olenski's accusation was almost certainly true. Ellen was young, she was frightened, she was desperate. What more natural than that she should be grateful to her rescuer? The pity was that, in the law's eyes and the world's, one affair with the secretary made her as wicked as her husband with his many mistresses. And Newland had explained to her that simple, kind-hearted New York was exactly the place where she could least hope for understanding. Having to make these facts plain to her, and watching her miserable acceptance of them, had been extremely painful to him. He was glad that he alone knew her secret, which would have horribly embarrassed her relations. And when he told her family she had decided not to ask for a divorce, they were all very grateful to him for sparing them so much unpleasantness. These thoughts reminded him so strongly of his last talk with Madame Olenska that, as the curtain fell on the lovers' parting, his eyes filled with tears, and he stood up to leave the theatre. In doing so, he saw Madame Olenska in a box with the Beauforts and some other people. He had tried to avoid meeting her socially, but now their eyes met, and as Mrs. Beaufort waved to him to join them, it was impossible to refuse. He greeted the Beauforts, but soon found himself sitting beside the Countess. She turned and spoke to him in a low voice. "Do you think," she asked, looking towards the stage, "the lover will send her a bunch of yellow roses tomorrow morning?" Newland reddened, and his heart jumped in surprise. He had visited her only twice, and each time had sent her yellow roses, but without giving his name. She had never mentioned them before. Now, the fact that she knew he had sent them and connected them to the scene they had just watched filled him with pleasure. "I was thinking of that too," he said. To his surprise, she blushed, and said after a pause, "What do you do when May is away?" "I get on with my work," he replied, a little annoyed by the question. The Wellens always spent February in Florida, as their doctor considered the warm weather there necessary for Mr. Welland's chest, and they were there now. Newland had realized there was no chance of persuading them to break the habit of a lifetime, so he had not tried. He would have liked to go with them, but he, too, was tied by custom and habit. No serious-minded young men took holidays in midwinter. He was conscious Madame Olenska was looking at him. "I understand that you were right about the divorce," she said a little breathlessly, "but sometimes life is difficult." "I know. And I wanted to tell you that I do feel you were right, and that I'm grateful to you." She lifted her opera glasses quickly to her eyes as she heard Beaufort coming to sit next to her. Newland stood up and left the box and the theater. The day before, he had received a letter from May in which she had asked him to be kind to Ellen in her absence. "She likes and admires you so much, and although she doesn't show it, she's very lonely and unhappy. You're almost the only person in New York who can talk to her about what she really cares for." His wise May! How he loved her for that letter! But he did not want, as an engaged man, to be too obviously the Countess's defender and companion. She could probably take care of herself better than May imagined. She had several gentlemen around her who would be only too glad to be of assistance. But even so, he never saw her without feeling that, after all, May was right. Ellen Olenska was lonely, and she was unhappy. The next morning, Newland searched the flower shops for yellow roses, but found none. As a result of this search, he arrived late at the office, and noticed that his lateness made no difference at all to anyone. He was filled with sudden despair at the uselessness of his life. He was just one of the many young men in the old-fashioned law firms like Mr. Letterblair's, who sat at their desks or simply read the newspapers for a certain number of hours every day. They didn't need to earn money, but it was thought that young men should have something to do, and the law, being a profession, was considered to be more suitable work for a gentleman than business. Few of them had any ambition, and over many of them the gray dullness of an empty life was already spreading. It made Newland cold with fear to think it might be spreading over him, too. "I'll never do anything worthwhile," he thought angrily. "And my interest in books and paintings and music, my European travels, will I be able to keep any of that up when I'm married?" He thought about men he knew, men who in their younger days had been full of hopes and dreams as he was now. And what happened to them, he thought. Their lives became nothing more than one long, mindless, comfortable routine of dinners and visits and evening parties. From his office, he sent a note to Madame Olenska, asking if he could call on her that afternoon, but he received no reply that day or the next. This unexpected silence made him unreasonably angry. On the third morning, he received a note from her, and to his surprise, it had been posted from Skuytercliff. It said, "I ran away the day after I saw you at the theater, and these kind friends are allowing me to stay here as long as I like. I wanted to be quiet and think things over. I feel so safe here. I wish you were with us. Yours sincerely, Ellen Olenska." What is she running away from? He wondered. And why does she feel the need to be safe? However, she's certainly made an impression on the van der Luydens. They don't usually encourage their visitors to stay longer than a weekend. He felt disappointed that she was away. Then he remembered that he had an invitation from the Chiverses to spend this weekend with them at their country house, High Bank, which was not far from Skuytercliff. He wrote a hurried telegram and sent it off at once, accepting the invitation. Chapter 5. May surprises Newland. At High Bank, Newland was a dutiful guest until lunch on Sunday, when he borrowed a carriage and drove over to Skuytercliff. The van der Luydens' large country house never looked particularly welcoming, and now, in the depths of winter, it looked even less so. The servant who opened the door explained that Mrs. van der Luyden and the Countess were at church. Newland said he would walk to the church to meet the ladies. And as he walked along the path, he was delighted to see a figure in a red coat coming towards him. He hurried forward, and Madame Olenska stopped short with a smile of welcome. "Ah, you've come," she said, giving him her hand. "Mrs. van der Luyden has gone on to visit some friends, so I'm alone." The red coat made her look brilliantly pretty, like the Ellen of the old days. He replied, "I came to see what you were running away from." Her smile disappeared, but she answered, "You'll see soon." She added more cheerfully, "What does it matter now that you're here to protect me?" The blood rose to his face, and he caught the sleeve of her coat. "Ellen, what is it? You must tell me." "Oh, let's run a race first. My feet are freezing." And she ran away from him, her red coat bright against the snow. Newland started after her, and they met, laughing, under a tree. She looked up at him and smiled. "I knew you'd come." "That shows you wanted me to," he replied, his heart beating wildly with delight. They walked along together. The ground seemed to sing under their feet, and there was a mysterious brightness in the air. "May asked you to take care of me," she said after a while. "I didn't need any asking." "Ah, what a poor, helpless, defenseless thing you must all think I am. But women here seem not to feel the need." He lowered his voice to ask, "What sort of need?" "Ah, don't ask me. I don't speak your language." He stood still on the path, looking down at her. "What did I come for if I don't speak yours?" "Oh, my friend." She laid her hand lightly on his arm. "Ellen, why won't you tell me what's happened?" "I will tell you, but where? One can't be alone for a minute in that enormous house, with servants always in and out of every room. Is there nowhere in an American house where one may be by oneself? You're all so shy, and yet so public at the same time." "Ah, you don't like us," said Newland sadly. Just then they passed an ancient stone house called the Patroon's House, which the first owner of Skuytercliff had built and lived in 300 years before. The van der Luydens kept it to show to their visitors as a place of historical interest. "What luck!" cried Ellen. "We can go in and have a quiet talk. Someone's even lit a fire. No one will disturb us there." They went in and sat down by a bright fire. "When you wrote to me, you were unhappy," said Newland, watching her expressive face. "Yes, I was, but I can't feel unhappy when you're here." "I shan't be here very long." His lips felt stiff with the effort of saying just so much and no more. "I know, but I live in the moment when I'm happy. I don't look ahead." The words stole through him like a temptation. He got up and stood looking out through the window with his back to her. What if she had been running away from him, and she had waited to tell him until they were alone together in this secret place? "Ellen, please tell me. Tell me who you're running away from." For a long moment she was silent, and in that moment Newland imagined her, almost heard her, stealing up behind him to throw her light arms around his neck. But while he waited, his whole mind and body ready for that wonderful thing to happen, he saw a heavily coated man walking along the path to the house. The man was Julius Beaufort. "Ah," said Newland, bursting into a laugh, "so that's it." Madame Olenska ran to his side, slipping her hand into his, but when she saw Beaufort, her face went pale. "I didn't know he was here," she whispered. Her hand still held Newland's, but he drew away from her, and, walking into the hall, threw open the door of the little house. "Come in, Beaufort, this way. Madame Olenska is expecting you," he said. During his journey back to New York the next day, Newland thought bitterly of Beaufort. He was clearly the man Ellen was running away from. He was chasing her, and Julius Beaufort only ever had one purpose in mind when chasing pretty women. The next 2 or 3 days went by very slowly. There were moments when Newland felt he was being buried alive under his future. He heard nothing from Ellen until the 4th evening, when a note from her arrived at his house. It said simply, "Come late tomorrow. I must explain to you. Ellen." The young man spent all night thinking about the note. There were several ways of answering it. The reply he finally decided on at sunrise was to pack a bag with some clothes and jump on a boat which was leaving that day for Florida. When he walked down the sandy main street of St. Augustine and saw May Welland standing there with the sun in her hair, he wondered why he had waited so long to come. Here was truth. Here was reality. Here was the life that belonged to him.
"Newland, has anything happened?" she asked.
"Yes. I found I had to see you," he replied, and she blushed happily. They sat down on a bench under some orange trees, and he put his arm round her waist and kissed her. It was like drinking from a cool mountain stream on a hot summer's day. He explained to May's parents that he had come because he felt he might be getting a cold. Mr. Welland understood all anxiety over health only too well, and insisted he should stay at least a week with them to prevent any possible illness taking hold. He walked and read and went boating with May in the warm Florida sunshine. All the time he was thinking about their wedding, which seemed unimaginably far away. The day before he left, they were walking through the orange trees again, when suddenly he burst out, "Can't you understand, May? I want to make our dreams real. I want you to be my wife now rather than later, this year rather than next." For a moment, May was silent. Then, clear-eyed, she looked straight at him.
"I'm not sure I do understand. Is it because you're not certain of continuing to care for me?"
Newland was shocked into saying, "My God, perhaps, I don't know." Both were silent for a moment.
"If that is it, then is there someone else? Let us talk honestly, Newland. I've felt a difference in you since our engagement was announced."
"My dear, what madness," he managed to say.
"It won't hurt us to talk about it. You could so easily have made a mistake. Anyone can."
"If I had made a mistake of the kind you suggest, is it likely I would be begging you to marry me sooner?" She thought for a moment.
"Yes,"
she said at last.
"You might want to decide the matter once and for all."
Her calm intelligence took his breath away, but he could see how painful this was for her. She continued,
"You know, a girl sees more than her parents imagine. I've always known there was someone in your past. I saw her once. Her face was sad, and I felt sorry for her, and I remembered that when we got engaged."
"My dear child, is that all? If you only knew the truth."
"Then there is a truth I don't know?"
"I mean, the truth about that old story."
"But that's what I want to know. Newland, I couldn't build my happiness on a wrong done to another woman. I understand that when two people really love each other, they might have to go against public opinion. And if you feel yourself in any way promised to that woman, and if there is any way you can keep your word, even by her getting a divorce, then, Newland, don't give her up because of me."
He had never admired May so much as at that moment. How brave of her to speak so plainly, and how generous to offer to give him up to his former mistress. But with all her intelligence, she had not seen what was troubling him. "There was no promise of the kind you think, but I love you for saying that. I mean, every woman's right to her freedom." He stopped, surprised by the direction his thoughts were taking. May turned her blushing face towards him, and as he bent to kiss her, he saw her eyes were full of happy tears. For a moment, he had seen a woman who could think for herself, a woman who was prepared to break away from society's rules. But the next moment, he was disappointed to see the old, dutiful May return. She seemed to be aware of his disappointment, but without knowing what to do about it. They walked silently home. 2 days after his return to New York, Newland called on old Mrs. Manson Mingott to persuade her to use her influence with the Wellens about an early wedding date for him and May. She was amused by his urgency and agreed to help. The Countess, who was visiting her grandmother, was also there and listened thoughtfully to this conversation. Newland had a few minutes alone with her when she walked with him to the front door. "When can I see you?" he asked in a low voice.
"Whenever you like, but it must be soon if you want to see the little house again. I'm moving next week."
For a moment, he was back again in the exotic atmosphere of her sitting room. "Tomorrow evening?" he asked.
"Tomorrow, yes, but come early. I'm going out later."
It was only 8:30 when he arrived at her house. In the sitting room, he found Medora Manson, Ellen's aunt, who had just arrived back from a long trip to Cuba. She greeted him, and while they waited for Ellen to join them, told him she had a letter from the Count to give to her niece.
"Yes, my poor foolish Olenski," she added. "All he asks is to take her back as his wife."
"Good God!" cried Newland, jumping up.
"You are horrified? Of course I do not defend him, but just think what she is giving up if she stays here. Palaces, jewels, art, priceless furniture, music, brilliant conversation. Forgive me, my dear young man, but one does not find that here. The truth is, Mr. Archer, I have heard of your influence over dear Ellen, and I hoped I might count on your support to persuade you—"
"That she ought to go back? I would rather see her dead," cried the young man violently.
"Ah," said Mrs. Manson calmly, "am I to understand you prefer that?"
She